Hello, welcome to this Lit in 5 video giving an introduction to Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. This video should be viewed first, really, before the videos go into banks of 3, going through banks of 3 chapters at a time. In this video, I'll be giving an introduction with some conventions of what is retrospectively defined as Golden Age crime fiction, and also introducing some key ideas and some AO2 techniques in relation to Christie's narrator, Dr. James Shepherd. Okay, so in front of you now are the 3 previous Section B questions which AQA have set on the crime paper 2. Remember, Section C, you need to use the other 2. So whichever text you go for in Section B, whether that's the crime poetry, whether that's atonement, whether that's Roger Ackroyd, whichever one you choose for Section B, you are required to and must use the other 2 texts to do your Section C answer. So that requires tactics, doesn't it? You should look at your Section C question first, in my opinion, and then think about which 2 texts are going to be the best to use in your opinion to answer that question in Section C. There's a choice of 2. That will then leave 1 behind, which you then must use for Section B. You only choose 1 question. There is only a choice of 1 question for each of the 3 texts. So ideally, you're happy that the question you see, for example, for Roger Ackroyd as a single text is nice and doable. Then you'll choose Roger Ackroyd, and then that leaves the poetry and Ian McEwan for your Section C answer. Remember, there's a choice of 2 for Section C, but I'll go over that in lessons. The reason why I put this up here is that linked to the sheet I've given you on what AQA see as the ingredients of crime writing, which I've numbered 1 to 16, I think, it'd be useful here to look at what has been said and then to start to hypothesize and anticipate the things which might be set in future years. So you can look here, 2019, 2018, they had a society focus, a societal focus in each of the questions. And in the first year this new specification ran, the focus was on the process of detection is more interesting than the characterization. So in lessons or together, or yourselves as classmates, you might start to work through and start to anticipate what might be set. If you look at your 1 to 17, it's not 16, sorry, 1 to 17 of the ingredients of crime writing that AQA have given you, that I've condensed for you, look at number 8, the dynamic between the detective and the criminal or criminals, the hero detective, if you like, and their nemesis. That might be something which is set. Remember, it's always in the wording of a debate. It's a statement which is to be debated. So I'm just thinking out loud here, but perhaps there might be something like the relationship between the detective and criminal is important. The marginal or extra or wider or other characters serve little to no purpose in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. To what extent do you agree with this view of the novel? Explore the writer's methods. So there's one that I've sort of clumsily created. I'd have to tinker with the wording of that, but that's one, okay? We can go through these, we can write some of these. More useful, I think, given that these have gone, is to start anticipating, looking at your sheet of 17 things, what the next question might be. Remember, there will be only 1 question. There are no choices of question relating to Roger Ackroyd, the crime poetry, atonement. There is only the 1 to choose from. You do have more wriggle room with the other 2, because there are 2 choices of question in Section C. Section C is the very broad genre-specific question. So things like, in crime writing, the guilty are justly or fittingly punished. explore the significance of punishment in 2 crime texts you've studied, explore authors' methods. That's always in there, okay? So there's your tactics, and then there's a sort of half a glance towards possible future questions. Moving on. Okay, let's whisk you through some conventions, the kind and type of novel this is. Mainly to look at when Christie follows or adheres to, but AQA are sort of more interested in the moments and the ways in which writers subvert, adapt or alter genres. You've got 2 exam papers, tragedy and crime. Like I say, they're more interested in moments. If the question allows, don't just shoehorn it in for the sake of it. Where writers adapt and evolve genre. It is not a fixed, rigid literary form. Writers often come along and add sort of changes or evolve. In fact, Christie is celebrated for her ability to take what is retrospectively defined as golden age crime fiction. No one wakes up one morning and goes, I'm going to create the golden age of romantic fiction. It's a term that critics put on it afterwards. But she was an innovator in ways that we'll show you in a moment, often to the point of critical condemnation. Oh, you can't do that with crime fiction, this is cheating, or this is not crime fiction as we know it. She didn't care, and she adapted and evolved it in very significant ways. So, I'm not going to read through all of this, it's on the screen for you. You can pause it and zoom in and have a look at this. So, there's the Golden Age. And that splits off into 2 subgenres. One involving Agatha Christie, where you have the detectives as the intuitionists, and then something called the realists. You can read that if you want, but we're only interested in the Agatha Christie stuff. So, Golden Age, the intuitionists, also being called classical mystery texts. This is a key thing here now. The intuitionists did not want their audience to be a spectator. They wanted the reader to be involved in solving the mystery. So we go along with the detective and the narrator if they're also part of solving the mystery. So there's the sort of thrill and the excitement of it. If you've ever watched a crime genre, you sat around as a family, there'll always be, usually, someone in the family, it's him. Yeah, I said it was him from 2 minutes in. I spotted it, yep, I got it right. How clever am I? Yep, there you go. And either they do or they don't. So this is part of the thrill of this genre and its popularity. So the intuitionist genre puts the reader in a position where he or she is able, as the detective, to solve the crime through logic, intelligence and intuition. Okay, key things there: the focus on the detective and the crafty plot involving puzzles. Critics have often referred to Christie in a negative way, being very critical of her, as writing animated algebra. So sort of the value of X dancing about on a page. That's quite cruel. It might not be your cup of tea, but she is very gifted in this genre, in my opinion. But there's how some people have regarded it. This subgenre holds little danger towards the detective, so you never see Poirot or Miss Marple with a knife to their throat or locked in a kennel with some angry dogs who are hungry. It's not that kind of detective fiction. So keep an eye out for that. We'll talk about a genteel atmosphere in a moment. The stories are about puzzle and mystery. So the language of the intuitionist text is quite polite and formal. Every now and again, Poirot will be just sort of suddenly brisk and abrupt with people. He'll sort of be very blunt and, I don't want to say attack, verbally he'll sort of focus in on someone and scold them a little bit. But, you know, this isn't fisticuffs, this is not that kind of genre. Some of the texts have been termed country house whodunits. You can use these in essays, or of the cosy school, or often sometimes referred to as cosy mysteries. These are perfectly fine to show knowledge of the genre and whether it follows, adheres to, and where it deviates from the cosy mystery or the country house whodunit. They're often set in a conservative English world. in a small village or country house. Atmosphere is an essential part. And then you got here what is setting up the idea of a juxtaposition between the conservative English house, allegedly with the veneer of dignity. You see those two previous past questions that have been set before. That's inviting you in that direction, I think. And then the violent crime, don't be expecting anything along the lines of Saw 14 or, anything kind of grotesque. But there is an interesting juxtaposition. Part of that is to be used as a societal critique that within these supposed houses of middle class respectability, criminal and deviant, and a good word to use, transgressive behaviour does go on. And as we'll see when we do the novel, hardly any character is exempt or morally virtuous. Most of them, if not all of them, are mired, M-I-R-E-D, in some form of sin, corruption or criminality. So there's like a two fingers salute to the notion of supposed gentility and respectability. The Queen of Crime Fiction, Agatha Christie, and she also gave one of the first female detectives in Miss Marple. Typo mistake there, not Miss Maple. She's not some kind of detective of sticky syrup. Christie was very popular in the 20s and 30s. She used, like a lot of the intuitionist school of crime writers, the same character types that could be categorised. So we'll do a little bit more on those in a moment, but you need to understand that a lot of people, myself included, I guess, when I first read this, it was like, these characters are dull, they're two-dimensional, this is not my kind of fiction at all. However, that is the purpose within the confines of this genre. You're meant to have stock character types that are characters who deviate from it, and there's a massive twist or two that we'll talk about later, but there's a mention here of Cluedo. Okay, so if you've ever played Cluedo, Colonel Mustard, so we have Major Hector Blunt. There's often a clerical figure, a member of the clergy. We don't have one in this particular instance, but Cluedo, Reverend Green, Miss Scarlet. If you know Cluedo, she's the beautiful sort of femme fatale who is the source of much admiration and attraction. So those kind of things, yes. And there's the parallel. This is because we have stock characters. Christie's focus was the puzzle and putting the pieces together, and not with any kind of realism or tremendous amounts of realism in a text. Moving on. Nice useful term for you here is the idea of a classical closed circle. So if you look at, there's a great film version of Murder on the Orient Express with, I think, Kenneth Branagh as Poirot. That's well worth a watch to give you just the sort of flavour, and an amazing cast. Anyone who's anyone. Who is it? Judi Dench, I've forgotten his name, Gandalf, Sir Ian McKellen, half the fella. I think they're all in there, so it's a brilliant watch. This meant that no external forces could interfere with the crime, and it also meant that each suspect is known. It also helps establish the convention in this subgenre. Remember, refer to the intuitionists as a subgenre of crime fiction, that each suspect in the circle had a reason to kill the victim. Okay, two consequences or effects of that. Remember, there's no point in identifying techniques or tropes of a genre if you're then not going to push it into effects. So that lends to a sense of claustrophobia, all right? Everyone is there, no one can escape. There's one character, Ralph Patton, who we'll talk about in a different way, so maybe he's a bit exempt from that. But the murderer is in this room. Dun, dun, dun. And then that maximum sort of tension, mystery and suspense for the reader and within the world of the characters as well. They start to panic because their eyes are everywhere and they dart around. They are locked in a room with a murderer. Okay, so there's your kind of double sense. No one's escaping, claustrophobia, but it really ramps up and amplifies that tension. Okay. So there's a little thing about the murder on the Orient Express. You don't need to go into that. Third paragraph, we have the idea that the red herring, okay? So misdirection, things that will deceive you, characters who will deceive you, many characters under suspicion at once, brings you in. It implicates you. You have the same challenge as the detective. This is a requirement and part of the allure and fascination of this genre. So keep an eye as you go through chapter to chapter, how your head is turned this way, how Christie, is a good AO2 term, focalises the reader's attention on this character. Oh, they're looking a bit guilty now. Then the camera will turn, the focalisation will shift to Reverend Green, not a real character, I'm just using the Cluedo ideas, and then your head is constantly spinning. There's a nice quote from Dr. Shepherd about the turn of the kaleidoscope. That's a great sort of metaphor for reading this kind of fiction and how writers like Christie of this kind of fiction operate. There's a decent line there in the end of the second paragraph, but the clues were all there that prompted the reader along with Poirot. So it's not unrealistic or unfeasible to call this a circular narrative. It is the kind of genre, as we're going to demonstrate, where once you've read it once, you're invited, maybe sort of expected, to reread it so that you can say, now I see where that was going. So a circular narrative is a perfectly accurate way of classifying the structure and the plotting of these kinds of novels. So those bullet points, those first chunk of bullet points there, they're very, very important to read. I'm not going to read through them with you. The way they word things is lovely. Serious transgression of moral boundaries. These are the notes you should be playing as and when you're invited or needed or required to talk about the conventions and how Christie uses them or manipulates or subverts them. Please keep an eye on the second one, a reliable sidekick who can report the action. Ironic tick. More on that later. Just have a look at the first one as well regarding Poirot and the adjective an unorthodox detective. We'll need to look closely at the portrayal of the detective. We've mentioned how we have stock characters. One of the most well-drawn or most vivid characters in these kind of texts is the detective, okay? They are the one that comes off the page a little bit more than the stock character of the retired military colonel or, Reverend Green or the femme fatale or the beautiful woman. They're kind of the selling point of the book, certainly for me. That and the criminal, okay? They're a little bit more developed than the two-dimensional stock character. And you'll see the eccentricities and the strange sort of quirks of behaviour which end up being characteristic and significant of Poirot. So we'll come across those as we meet him. There are even moments I'm going to show you when we get into the chapter videos where the way Poirot is presented, you deliberately, I think, encourages, is this a world-famous detective? What's he doing on his hands and knees, picking up a feather? Is this fella all there? Is he the full shilling? But this is obviously another form of misdirection. Yes, he might be obsessing over a quill or a feather at the back of a shed, but, as you will see, there is absolute method in his supposed madness. So there's that unorthodox sort of eccentric nature. Secrets and lies, massively important in a novel like this, could even be the focus of a question from AQA. The third from bottom there, a society which hides corruption beneath a respectable veneer, linked to that idea of the English country house and the cosy mystery again. So they're there, but we've already started to explore why we put something as shocking as a murder within these Settings. Settings, another question that has yet to be set individually in section B. It may have cropped up in section C. I'd have to double check, but it's never appeared yet for Roger Ackroyd. I wonder. Okay, so there's some very important stock ingredients to get your head around and use this language as well. Moving on. Okay, if you're Agatha Christie, then, or any writer where someone has been an extremely successful and celebrated writer of a genre. So imagine being a sort of playwright who has to write plays after William Shakespeare. Imagine having to write crime when Arthur Conan Doyle has, kind of boosted the whole genre and opened it to wider possible audiences. You can either feel intimidated by that, or you can sort of wear your influences out in the open and be a bit sort of postmodern about it, really, in the sense that, yes, of course, I've been influenced by this, but what do you do to avoid claims of unoriginal or not being original or unoriginality? Well, you give things a twist, or you subvert or adapt, and you play with the expectations of readers. Playing and parody and adapting conventions of genre, critics and theorists refer to as a postmodern thing. So, for example, in certain postmodern things, you'll have characters in a film just stop and talk to the audience, and they'll break the fourth wall and say, "This isn't real, is it?" Or they'll address the camera and say, "This is the point where I'm going to kill the murderer now." Think about things like Austin Powers and Shrek, how they parody and send up the straight-faced versions of their genre, so the James Bond films or the fairy tale within, and they're kind of playful and parodic with it. There's no playful parody here, but there is some very clever and surprising subversions. So read through this. I'm not going to read through all of it with you. You can pause it. The key thing I want to focus you in on, though, a further parallel between Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson is Poirot and his, how it's worded here, apparently supportive sidekick, Dr. Shepherd, helping and aiding Poirot in the detection of the murderer. Okay, so two doctors supporting the detective. Imagine how the reader is going to approach Christie's novel. Having known through popular culture or being a reader of them themselves. Oh, we got another cheerful doctor, medical man here. Oh yes, good ally, yes. Poirot will crack this one. He's got a medical man who knows the village assisting him here. The reader will arrive with expectations. In a way, they'll have a sort of, they think they will have a comfortable familiarity with the fact that the inspector and retired detective, Poirot, has another medical sidekick. There will be a sense of familiarity here, but we know what writers can and often do get up to with familiarity. Here's a nice little contextual thing in terms of AO3, and this is from Matthew Pritchard, Christie's grandson. So before we were talking about how the English country house and the cosy mystery, the classical closed circle of respectability, here's Christie's grandson on, I guess, what he sees as Christie's intentions behind placing these criminal acts of murder and bloodshed within these settings. So the murder of Roger Ackroyd freezes English rural society at a crucial turning point, Pritchard is arguing. After World War II, rural life in England would never quite be the same again, and the key position that the characters like Mrs. Shepherd played at the hub of community gossip would disappear with the breakdown of social strata and the advent of modern technology. My grandmother continued to exploit this calm and seemingly innocuous, two great words there, seemingly innocent, seemingly harmless, backdrop of village life repeatedly in later works, and used it to offset or juxtapose with deliberately clashing with some of the most heinous and bloody crimes. A murder here in King's Abbot. You may know the television programme Midsummer Murders, or the detective series Inspector Morse, and part of that is, how could this happen in a beautiful little rural village like Midsummer, or how can murder happen so much in the academic town of Oxford, which is where all the Morse stuff is set? It can, it does, and that's part of the shock and horror and repugnance and disgust writers try to generate through this. Just want to come back on seemingly innocuous. So, the man in the street, Mr. Smith, the country gentleman from down the road, Mr. Jones, who goes out to work every morning and comes home and walks his dog and feeds the plants and has a nice cup of tea and goes to bed. This is the stock in trade of writers of Golden Age fiction. Innocuous, the seemingly ordinary, harmless and everyday, the seemingly respectable. Do they have a dark alter ego or another side to them? It's not quite getting into Gothic territory, but it does have some influence with this idea of duality. If you think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, well, Dr. Jekyll, if you look at it, Dr. J. Kill, Dr. I. Kill, and then Hyde, Hyde, obviously you're invited to think of that as Hide. Can you see where I'm going with this? Moving on. T.S. Eliot, a writer who couldn't have been more different from how Agatha Christie writes, was a massive fan. He was a Christie head. He was a Christieite. He was trying to think of a better name, like Belieber or something like that. I don't know. He loved Agatha Christie, all right, and he loved The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, which many regard as the first detective novel, and he laid down some rules of what should make for a good detective story. So I'm not going to read those. Christie breaks a couple of them. She's prone to doing that, of course, and even though she did, T.S. Eliot still loved her to bits and loved her writing. So you can have a little read through that. Maybe look at number 5. The detective should be highly intelligent, absolutely with Poirot, but not superhuman. We should be able to follow his inferences and almost, but not quite, make them with him. So there's that idea of the reader's love of this genre, to guess and second guess and anticipate and predict, but we're never quite at the level of almost foresight sometimes and prescience of Poirot. Okay, so before we start looking at chapters 1 to 3, and given that you have lots of literatures to study, other subjects that demand your time and effort, we're cutting straight to the chase here, okay? So this is my official spoiler warning, all right, in terms of who the murderer is in our Golden Age whodunit text, Golden Age with adaptations and subversions of the genre, but more of that as we go through it. So this is a chance, okay? But I strongly believe you have enough to do, so let's cut straight to the chase and the spoiler, so you can begin your study and your rereading and your second and third rereading of the text that you have to know very well, even though it's an open book exam, to then go and ace it on your examination. So with that in mind, I'll do one last countdown, a spoiler warning, 3, 2, 1, because we're going to discuss how the guilty party, how the murderer is Dr. James Shepherd. Dun dun dun. Now that we have that shocking revelation out of the way, let's begin at the end. The last chapter of the novel. The reason why I'm choosing to do this is that when very shortly we're going to start again at chapter 1, 2 and 3, you can see the suggestions. I'm going to show you the suggestions and the hints and the idea of the criminal hiding in plain sight, and the idea of elision and evasion, and a word I'm going to point out to you, reticence, which starts structurally to become a much more significant part of Christie's structuring from chapters 23, 24, 25, 26 and 27. So there's method in my madness here, starting at the end, and then we can see with greater depth, greater clarity. You can just see more, basically, now that you know who the guilty party is. So let's have a bit of a zoom in on chapter 27 here. So the first thing I want to zoom in on here is the opening of chapter 27, looking very closely at Shepherd's narrative voice and his confession of all things. So I finished my task, I finished my manuscript, which is what he's writing, and he's, as you'll see shortly, Poirot instructs him to go and finish the manuscript. He says here, Shepherd, "A strange end to my manuscript. I meant it to be published someday as the history of one of Poirot's failures. Odd how things pan out." Now, if you scratch away at the psychology of that statement, then there's a certain amount of gloating and rivalry and one-upmanship and competition and vanity and ego, I would suggest, underneath the character of Dr. James Shepherd. The fact that if he were to get away with the crime successfully, he will have thwarted and defeated the world-renowned, famous investigative detective of Hercule Poirot. That hasn't come to pass, but the intention was the writing of this manuscript was to eventually reveal it one day and sort of gloat from wherever he would be hiding in the world that I have bested the best, or one of the best. That's very important in terms of why this story has been written at the level of Dr. James Shepherd. Obviously Agatha Christie is in charge of what Shepherd says, but at no point, and this is a really key point here, at no point in the preceding chapters of this novel has Shepherd confessed to it. As we're going to go through now, when we start at chapter 1, we are looking at things like misdirection. We are looking for the way he is trying to make you suspicious of and suspect every other character, well, not every other character, but plenty of other characters, in place of himself, to divert attention away from himself. It's only now, at the end of chapter 26 and 27, that he has been accused and proven guilty of the crime, that he actually confesses. So, prior to this, everything is about misdirection and hiding himself in plain sight and averting suspicion onto many other characters. We'll also see as well in a moment on the next slide, he's got sort of literary pretensions as well. So he's been keeping this manuscript, and I'll show you shortly how he asks Poirot what he thinks of the manuscript, with an aim to having it published one day. So he has that level of vanity there that, I'll publish this and have it as a bestseller, and I'll be, it'll be the unique memoirs or manuscript or tale of the person who defeated the famous Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. Just to reinforce that point about having literary ambitions and literary pretensions, have a look on the screen now in the second column there. I'm rather pleased with myself as a writer. What could be neater, for instance, than the following? And then he quotes himself in a very self-congratulatory pat on the back in terms of, oh yes, I have a mean literary style. There's nothing here of remorse, or not a great amount of remorse. This is someone who's plunged a knife into somebody's neck. He isn't racked with guilt. All you have is that very flippant, throwaway, casual remark, which I've just mentioned. Odd how these things pan out. Wow. I mean, you could take that to the idea of being extremely cold and detached. I guess he is a doctor, which is part of the brilliance of Christie using him as the murderer, and as we're going to get into, disguised as a sort of pseudo Hastings figure as the Watson, to Poirot's Sherlock Holmes. Another brilliant bit of sleight of hand and deception by Agatha Christie, but more of the fact of choosing a doctor and putting him in that role of assistant to the detective later on. But yeah, there he is. Absolutely proud as anything about, haven't I got a lovely literary style? This is a murderer. Okay, so all you have in terms of that is a sort of, well, if the trouble were after only all something to do with Ralph, well, no harm would have been done. But again, that isn't, oh my goodness, dear Roger, etc., etc., I've killed another man. Such a shame it had to involve him. That isn't quite the same as regret or racked with guilt. Or tormented with remorse or guilt, is it? Not the same at all. A slight interesting moment here, I think, before we reinvestigate the novel and resume it, if you like, at chapter 1 and go over it again. This is Shepherd almost being annoyed at the powers of observation from what he calls here the trained servant complex. As we go through now, I think Christie is cleverly suggesting Shepherd's sort of superiority and how he sees servants or staff with a sense of inferiority. There's a certain amount of snobbery and looking down his nose at them. So maybe quite ironic that the powers of observation from Parker here with the moved chair has also led to his discovery as the criminal. So he says here, logically, Parker, he ought to have been so agog over the body as to be blind to everything else, but I hadn't reckoned with the trained servant complex. So I'm bringing that up now as we start our journey again, just to reinforce moments where he's a bit supercilious, ooh, nice word, and looks down his nose at servants. A sort of bit of disdain towards them, I think, as well. Maybe with a sense of his superiority, but there's also the other side of that, the sense of inferiority, of not being ranked at the same level or status as people like Roger Ackroyd. I think there's some kind of bitterness, which is subconscious within the character of James Shepherd, which Agatha Christie is hinting at. Last little note here, which is very important to sort of societal concerns here and the crime within the society of King's Abbot. The idea of respectability here, still being seen to have a sense of respectability to do with the family name or how society around this village will view the surviving members of the family. So, my greatest fear all through has been Caroline. I have fancied she might guess. Curious the way she spoke that day of my strain of weakness. I should not like Caroline to know. She is fond of me, and then, too, she is proud. My death will be a grief to her, but grief passes. Okay, so there's still that concern for respectability and how the name of the Shepherd family and his siblings will not be ruined societally by this. And he says he can trust Poirot to not reveal that and make it the topic of gossip. Look at the coldness here as well and lack of remorse. Not that I take responsibility for Mrs. Farrar's death. It was the direct consequence of her own actions. I feel no pity for her. So her overdosing on Veronal, he doesn't see that as his responsibility or that he is to blame for that. Obviously he can prescribe and give her that, but the conversation earlier with Miss Russell in chapter 1 that we're coming to in terms of Veronal in a moment. And then there's that poetic sort of irony. I have no pity for myself either. Psychologically, in terms of the crime and the criminal, not a tremendous sense of self-worth. And maybe that's part of his motivations as we go through now. And then there's that tone of regret. Almost that it's a cruel twist of fate that one of the world's greatest detectives just happens curse my bad luck, says James Shepherd, to have landed in my village, and I wish Hercule Poirot had never retired from work and come here to grow vegetable marrows. A cruel twist of luck for the criminal indeed. Okay, so what I just mentioned there in terms of Dr. James Shepherd's narrative is very, very important. It's slightly confusing, I think, so I want to try and clarify that now. But whilst I clarify it, I want to flag up lots of AO2, so lots of writers' techniques as we go through this. So what I want to get you to understand here is what I'm going to call a two-tiered, two layers, two levels of interpretations. So above everything, of course, is the author, Agatha Christie. So she's writing this, and she's obviously, you know, a master in terms of doing this kind of whodunit mystery. She was celebrated for it. So, as we mentioned earlier, she has the conventions of this style of crime text. So, multiple suspects, check. Only reveals the murderer at the end, check. Suspicions, the reader's suspicions, shifting throughout the entire narrative. 1 minute you think it's this person, then that's challenged because you're encouraged to look at another character and are they guilty? Check. Plenty of foreshadowing in terms of who the actual criminal is, if and once you know who the criminal and the murderer is, something which you only kind of get on a second and third reading. Check. So Christie is in charge of all of that. Why? Well, to do what anyone reading this genre requires, the expectations of the genre, which is suspense, almost laying down that challenge to the reader and their detective skills. These are expectations which have to be fulfilled within the reader by the writer. However, underneath that, you have Agatha Christie's narrator, Dr. James Shepherd. Now, as we've just mentioned, when we looked at chapter 27, the giveaway, the reveal, the denouement, the unknotting of everything, then that's the only time in the narrative when James Shepherd is candid and open and explicit about himself being the murderer. So you might be wondering, why not write the narrative where he's open and confesses to the reader from chapter 1? Well, there are many reasons for that, of course. I'm talking here at the level of character, okay? The main overall reason is that Agatha Christie is in charge of Dr. James Shepherd. So there's one reason why he doesn't begin the narrative with, I couldn't stand that Roger Ackroyd. He threatened to give up the news that I was blackmailing Mrs. Faraz. I wasn't going to stand for that, so I stabbed him in the neck. Okay, you don't have your whodunit then for the entirety of the narrative. But I want to look at the level of character, albeit a character, like any character, isn't real. They are a construct. So, why doesn't James Shepherd reveal at the outset that he is the murderer? Well, number one, if he did, at the level of character, when Poirot acquires the manuscript, then Poirot would know straight away that James Shepherd has done it. Don't forget as well, as we've just explored, Dr. Shepherd has literary ambitions, doesn't he? And we've just seen as well that he intended to sort of gloat and score a victory over the world-famous Hercule Poirot. So, given those literary ambitions, given the fact that Dr. Shepherd wants to best or thwart Poirot, it suggests that he wants to publish his own bestseller at the end of this. So he wants to get away with it, obviously, as, you know, I guess any criminal would. But, yeah, he does have literary ambitions to be up there with the famous crime writers of the day and of the era. So he also presumably wants to gloat at the end. So he will keep his manuscript of chapters 1 to 26 techniques, keeping the reader in the dark, to then, if things had have gone to plan and he wasn't caught by Poirot's brilliance, then he can have a sort of double gloat, or two ways to gloat at the end. Victory over Poirot, but also, you, dear reader, never saw it was I, Dr. James Shepherd, who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars and eventually killed Roger Ackroyd. So, that's how I'm going to try to explain this. You have to understand at the level of the author, in which she has to satisfy her reader, who have expectations of this genre. But I wanted to try and get some kind of credible reasons as to why Dr. Shepherd, and this is at the level of character, remember Christie is in charge of what Shepherd does or does not do, as to why he never confesses from the opening chapter. Two reasons then. He wants to publish his own life events as a bestseller. He has literary ambitions. And number two, to reveal himself with the big sort of reveal at the end that he has bested Hercule Poirot. I also want that to come in mind in terms of the following techniques, okay? Narrative perspective. This is obviously a first-person intradiegetic narrator. So a narrator who is involved and part of the narrative themselves. They are not outside, they are not extra-diegetic, they are intra-diegetic. Now, first-person narration can be, depending on how it's used, limited and partial. It cannot travel across to the streets down the road or two houses next door or tell us what's happening in Peru this afternoon. The reader is only afforded what that one person, that narrator, first person narrator, can see, has heard and can tell us. So from that point of view, it is very effective in terms of being limited and partial. We are only able to see what Dr. James Shepherd affords us and tells us and sees. Maybe more importantly, doesn't tell us. What Agatha Christie has him hint at, maybe idea of his vanity, building up towards, oh, what a brilliant literary writer this criminal is. He's given us suggestions in chapter 1 that he was the guilty party. It's actually not him, it's obviously Christie above that in charge of it, to then have the big reveal. What a great writer, what a brilliant criminal mind. Obviously Poirot comes along and ruins that for him. So, critics have also referred or corrected the fact that Shepherd is to be regarded as the unreliable first-person narrator. So in the opening of the book, that is challenged. He's not so much an unreliable first-person narrator. He is an untrustworthy first-person narrator. He leaves out, okay, rather than has an unreliable narrative point of view, okay? He hints, he suggests, he does have clues in there about the big reveal of himself as the murderer. That's thanks to Christie. But it's not quite accurate to say unreliable. So we were speaking about reticence, and we need to speak about elision. What is left out and not said? That's not quite the same as unreliable. Final thing on this, we must now bear in mind that James Shepherd's characterisation of others, which of course is actually Agatha Christie's characterisation of others, but the way Shepherd, at the level of narrative events, portrays other characters, that is designed to divert attention away from himself. Remember, he wants to prove to you how brilliant he is as a crime writer, as well as get away with the blackmail and the murder of Roger Ackroyd. He, at the level of his own literary aspirations, is also trying to partake and create misdirection and sleight of hand. If you have a quick look down the chapter listings of the book, you will see a great many of the titles are referring to other characters in the book. So if I just get hold of my copy here now, then you can see things like Who's Who in King's Abbot, Dinner at Fernley. Okay, they don't mention people by name explicitly, but Who's Who, that chapter gives you a plethora of people, of the characters in the village. Dinner at Fernley, many characters are present. Then we look at things like, I'm leaving out the legal characters, so there's no point in looking at Inspector Raglan is confident. He's never a suspect and he isn't part of it. But then we have number 10, the parlourmaid. Number 12, round the table. Many people gathered again. 14, Mrs. Ackroyd. 15, Geoffrey Raymond. 17, Parker. Deep breath. 18, Charles Kent. 19, Flora Ackroyd. 20, Miss Russell. 22, Ursula's story. 24, Ralph Patton's story. So there you go. Okay, so even in the structuring and the plotting of the novel, entire chapters are titled and devoted to scrutiny of other characters, those who serve as red herrings or to complicate and add complexity to the puzzle of who is guilty of the murder of Roger Ackroyd. So all of that sees Shepherd casting aspersions. So as we go through in our chapter specific videos, which I'm going to create for you, you'll see, and I will point out to you, the way Shepherd characterises, for example, one of the servants in the house. That is ultimately determined to get you looking their way and strongly suspecting their involvement, or as a co-participant maybe, in the murder of Roger Ackroyd. All of that, complete misdirection. As we now know, Shepherd is the guilty party, but he also wants to convince you of his skill as a crime writer in a sort of metafictional way. Okay, so we have a story, if you like, within the story. It's not massively so, but as we've shown to you, he does have aspirations of being an esteemed writer on publication of his own manuscript with the big reveal. So he has two goals, if you like. Okay, just to finish then, 3 moments here from the latter chapters in the book where Agatha Christie starts to raise the idea of reticence. Again, to give you further clues, building towards the grand reveal in terms of Dr. James Shepherd and the idea of reticence, holding back, withholding, refraining from, usually in regard to speech, certainly in the case of Dr. Shepherd. So let's have a look at these 3 quotes very quickly in short detail, and that's the end of our introduction video. So this is chapter 23, Poirot's little reunion. This ends with the, oh, and here's Ralph Patton now. Dun, dun, dun. And then into chapter 24. We see further clues happening here of how Poirot located the whereabouts of Ralph Patton. He goes through that here. And then we have Dr. Shepherd. I looked at him, Poirot, ruefully. Caroline's Home Office expert, I murmured, and to think I never guessed. Poirot here, or what Christie has Poirot say. You see now why I drew attention to the reticence of your manuscript, murmured Poirot. I like the murmuring here. It's being said low and only to Shepherd, in the sense that you get the sense that Poirot is about to reveal, though. So there's this kind of whispered sort of confidence towards Dr. Shepherd in the, well, now you know, I'm aware that you're holding things back, murmured Poirot. Your manuscript, was strictly truthful as far as it went, but it did not go very far, my friend. I was too abashed to argue. Okay, so we're seeing the calling out and the implied, slowly, gradually revealed understanding that Poirot knows who done it and who is the murderer. As quickly as I can here, some chapter 24 stuff. This is where the manuscript is with Poirot, and he's read it and he's gone through, and that is obviously a big mistake in terms of revealing who the guilty party is. So this is magnificent. You have written down your impressions as we went along. I nodded. Épatant, cried Poirot. Amazing. Let me see them this instant. Now, some errors here, some complacency, a mistake, you have to say, giving Hercule Poirot the written thoughts, even though he has been withholding information, James Shepherd, with the intent of releasing his world-famous whodunit. That is not a wise move, is it, to someone as intelligent and as intuitive as Hercule Poirot? So you've got here, look, I was not quite prepared for such a sudden demand. And just kind of over and adjacent to that, there's Caroline saying, I hope you've been careful about what you say about me in it. My jaw dropped. I had not been careful at all. So obviously that relates to he wasn't careful about what he said about Caroline, but this is an act of carelessness and something you have to say contributes to the final sort of reveal and exposure of him as the murderer. So here's Poirot in terms of the merit of the manuscript, being a sort of literary critic here. So, eh bien, I congratulate you on your modesty, and on your reticence, he added, taken aback. So there's that word again, modesty, reticence. Not so did Hastings write, continuing the idea that Shepherd is yet another kind of medical man who's accompanying and aiding Poirot in the investigation. But, ... Key line here, which Christie has Poirot say. But you have kept your personality in the background. Well, hasn't he just? Okay, so heavy implication, if you can have that. It's almost paradoxical. The strongest indication and suggestion yet, without the full explicit reveal of, you killed Ackroyd, didn't you? Yeah, okay then, go on. Ever closer now as we get towards the final chapters. And yet again, once he says that, I blushed a little before the twinkle of his eye. You'll see some stuff where we look at the twinkling of the eye. It's almost when Poirot's detective or investigative superpowers kick in, with that twinkling of his eye. His ability to perceive and spot and read and intuitive powers, that's one of his signatures. Okay, you want my candid opinion in terms of how you are as a writer? Well, we're getting towards being candid and open and explicit, aren't we, this late in the narrative? Further comments on Shepherd's manuscript there. A very meticulous and accurate account, he said kindly. You've recorded all the facts faithfully and exactly, though you have shown yourself becoming increasingly reticent as to your own share in them, in these events. So, further proof of the implied revelation and understanding that Poirot knows. There it is again, okay? So, reticence is being mentioned yet again. I think you meant to hear these two words turned up to 11. Though you have shown yourself becoming increasingly reticent. The reveal, the unveiling, the unknotting, the reason why the reader reads whodunits, the unveiling of who the criminal is. James Shepherd goes along with it in the sense that he still keeps up this pretense of innocence. When Poirot says, right, I'm going to unveil it now, I'm going to tell you all who done it when we gather. And then Shepherd says, or Christie has Shepherd say, you really believe that? I see that you do not, said Poirot dryly. Not yet do you appreciate Hercule Poirot at his true worth. So he's still maintaining that pretense and the illusion of being whiter than white and, the helpful doctor assisting the detective, all about to be brought crashing down with the reveal. And finally, the last mention of reticence here, as you can see in yellow, but Captain Ralph Patten must be cleared. I should suggest that you finish your very interesting manuscript of yours, but abandoning your former reticence. So now we've unlocked all that, we can start again in the individual chapter videos, 1 to 3, 4 to 6, all that kind of thing, looking at examples of such reticence. Remember, that works at the 2 levels, the 2 tiers, which I've tried to get you to understand, which I would love to see in essays. That will really blow an examiner's socks off. If you can interpret the narrative voice, this unassuming, seemingly innocent, helpful, law-abiding citizen, but show how that works at the level of the whodunit to give clues to the reader, but also at the level of character within the world of James Sheppard and the residence of King's Abbot. Okay, thanks for watching. Check out the videos on those chapters in banks of 3. It is not going to be massively detailed and go through every line. It's only going to pull out certain moments which speak to the notions or the aspects or the elements of crime. And I hope you find those useful too. Thank you very much.